Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on lectures 1 and 2 and seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. Who is the ego? 2. What was Freud's major discovery according to Lacan? And 3. What is the difference between symbolic time and imaginary time? If you learned something from this video, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Question 1. Who is the ego? Lacan begins by declaring that Seminar 2 will focus on the concept of the ego in Freud's theory, examining and considering criticisms of it. Lacan also plans to connect this concept to psychoanalytic technique as well as to what Lacan calls Freud's major discovery, which we'll identify shortly. The lack of success and inevitable resistance Freud encountered in his analyses led him to propose a new metapsychological model that included not only the ego, but also the id and superego. Lacan indicates we will examine texts from this period, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Group Psychology, and the Analysis of the Ego, as well as the ego and the id. So what or who exactly is this ego? It's a notion that has links with its philosophical counterpart. That philosophical ego is generally associated with the emergence of early modern thought, beginning with René Descartes, who, as the standard telling goes, grounds knowledge upon an indubitable foundation of thought that delivers a kind of certainty that I exist, the famous cogito ergo sum. Upon this rock, Descartes can reclaim the certainty of mathematics and the sciences. This cogito, the I think, comes to be an early iteration of the modern philosophical ego, and its principal characteristic is that it is what grounds knowledge in itself. Now, I say this is a standard telling because some analyses have demonstrated that Descartes' own thought may not fit so neatly within what has come to be called Cartesianism, despite it bearing his name. The ego continues to be refined in the early modern period, giving rise to what philosopher Charles Taylor has named the punctual self. Such a self is characterized by a kind of radical reflexivity that allows the mind to look at its own self, including its reasoning, will, and desires, as if from an extrinsic perspective. It is an abstraction of oneself whose power lies in the ability to fix things as objects. This mention of objects is important in relation to the ego. An object within this philosophical context is what can be objectified, rendered thoroughly observable, and defined by a set of properties or attributes. Central to the ego is its capacity to reduce things to objects, rendering them knowable, predictable, and capable of manipulation. This orientation has major ramifications not only for philosophy, but also for economics in the case of capitalism, which is founded upon the standardization and mass reproduction of objects, as well as science, which requires that things conform to operational definitions and thus be made objectifiable. You perhaps can already sense resonances here with Lacan's register of the imaginary and the characteristics of the ego that functions within it. Question 2. What was Freud's major discovery? In Lecture 10 of Seminar 1, Lacan states that the Freudian discovery was connecting the libido with neurosis and seeing neuroses as an indirect manner of satisfying the libido. Now in Seminar 2, Lacan offers another formulation of what he considers Freud's major discovery. In setting out to subvert this ego, Freud shows how the I is an other according to Lacan. Je est un autre. This I is not identified with the ego, individuality, or consciousness. But what does this mean? Who is the other? First, it's a subject, which already puts it at odds with the transcendental ego, the philosophical ego, which is an abstraction devoid of much subjectivity except for its self-transparent consciousness. Rather, this subject, who is an other, holds a decentered relation to consciousness, operating as an unconscious that eludes the certainties delivered by the ego. Though, as we saw in the previous seminar, there are elements of the ego that are also unconscious, and what's not entirely clear still to me is whether this makes up part of what Lacan calls the subject, or whether the subject makes up only part of what he calls the unconscious. It also raises a question as to where one may locate consciousness, since it's not fully equated with the ego. Lacan states that consciousness is what is transparent to itself, whereas the I, the subject, is not. Consciousness is also unlocalizable. A major emphasis in the first seminar was the degradation of Freud's theory and what followed him. These ego psychologists saw Freud as bringing back the ego, and thus theorizing began to focus on how the ego must be strengthened. For Lacan, this is a deeply problematic development as it amounts to a complicity between analysis and the illusions of our experience. In other words, it reinforces the problematic imaginary identifications that, as Lacan showed in the previous seminar, is the source of the analysand's problematic relationship with itself. Question number 3. What is the difference between symbolic time and imaginary time? Lecture 2 was a kind of direct follow-up to Lecture 1, and hence why I'm including it here, in that it's introducing the main topics of the seminar. It was also one of the more difficult lectures to follow. Perhaps this is in part because the audience was responding to Coire's lecture on Plato's dialogue, the Meno, the previous night. This led into a conversation about whether the Meno displays a logic consistent with psychoanalysis. Manoni suggests that they are different because, in part, whereas Maieudics, the Socratic teaching, brings to light a forgotten truth, which is in fact eternal, analysis brings to light historical truth of the subject, and this truth is discovered in error, and error is seen in truth. Lacan is not completely pleased with Manoni's assessment, though it's not clear that he directly addresses Manoni's comments, something that seems to be picked up by Hippolyte, who is also in the audience. Lacan appears to be interested in the relation of knowledge and a truth that is ungraspable by such knowledge. This is relevant to the Meno because the initial question raised by Meno to Socrates concerns the nature of virtue. Socrates ultimately demonstrates that excellence is not taught and so is not a kind of knowledge. Knowledge is the intuition of the eternal forms through reminiscence, which Lacan locates in the imaginary plane, along with, interestingly enough, a priori intuitions. However, there's also the eruption, or a kind of forcing in which the symbolic emerges, and in so doing, creates its own past. I think this is in reference to retroaction, and Lacan was speaking of something similar in the previous lecture, Lecture 1, when it came to the introduction of a new concept, such as the philosophical ego, which, once it appears, is retroactively seen as a concept that precedes its emergence. Whereas retroaction is an expression of symbolic time, the forgetting of the symbolic intervention and belief that something was there all along is a form of imaginary time. It's a forgetting of the creative function of truth in its nascent form, and it's what introduces error into knowledge. So one might ask where the ego is in Plato, for example. This would be sort of an anachronistic question, but one that happens frequently. All this reminds me a little bit of the situation in which an outcome seems predictable only after it happens. In social psychology, this is called the I knew it all along phenomenon. Or in sports, it might be called Monday morning quarterbacking. And just before recording this, I came across this meme, which I think aptly captures well not only how the ego, represented by the visitor center, emerges in relation to trauma, the asteroid impact, but also its sense of time and considering itself as having preceded itself. Lecture 2 concludes with an analysis of Beyond the Pleasure Principle by Pontelise. There are some interesting points worth mentioning. He identifies two ambiguities in the text. First, the compulsion to repeat seems to institute a kind of human progress by leading one to go beyond the limits of the pleasure principle, but it also has a regressive function, stagnating progress and operating as a pure automatism. Second, the ego is sometimes presented as an instinct for self-preservation and at other times a pursuit for death. Lacan mostly praises this analysis and goes on to say that no other text so profoundly questions the meaning of life as does Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Lacan will address these ambiguities as we proceed through Seminar 2. And with that, we will end today's video. The next video will examine Lecture 3 entitled The Symbolic Universe. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.